Well, I'm really excited to talk to you about teaching scales, mostly because for so much of my life, I didn't enjoy teaching scales. I will completely tell you that that was the truth. And there are lots and lots of reasons that this was a challenge for me, but I isolated the reasons that it was difficult for me and the reasons that I avoided it in almost every lesson. So my experience teaching scales was that you would teach them one key at a time, one hand at a time, and you would usually start with pentascales or five finger patterns, whatever you want to call them. And those would go okay for me. I always kind of enjoyed the process of teaching kids to go da 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 da, and just I don't know why, but that was always successful. And even trying to do that hands together, there were some kids that was difficult, but it wasn't that bad. But then the only next step was to do one octave scales, which would go sort of okay. And then the next step was always put them together. And that was the place where things became very difficult and uncomfortable. And I think there were so many reasons for that. One of them is that when you're teaching scales in traditional ways, if, for instance, the student doesn't cross their thumb under early enough, for instance, in the right hand, if they play 1, 2, 3, 4, and then they cross under, things just don't work out very well, but they don't get the feedback right at the moment where the problem happens. So there were so many things about it that were frustrating to me. The other thing was I just didn't like listening to it. I mean, I knew all my friends supposedly were starting every lesson with these scales, but it was so unpleasant to listen to. It didn't have any music in it. There was no melody. Every scale sounded exactly the same. And so, of course, it was not motivating for my students either. They didn't particularly want to do it. And then another problem was there was no rhythm, right? Rhythms in scales, yes, you can add rhythms to scales, which I do with my advanced students. They might play dun da da dun da 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 dun. But when you're talking about somebody who's barely learning their scales, how are you going to infuse rhythm into a scale pattern without confusing them? That was really a challenge for me. And then on top of it all, of course, there's no harmony, right? So you have something that's made up of single notes, but it's not exactly a melody. It's not something anyone particularly wants to sing along with. And there was no harmonic structure underneath it to help kids keep motivated and keep moving through the entire experience. So as I taught for so many years, I realized that what I wanted a solid step between five finger patterns, which were great for developing a hand position, and one octave scales. There was some place in there where I needed a lot of lateral space, a lot of space for a student to find the beauty of what a scale felt like. So for me, if I play an E major scale, it feels really good. I love how 2 and 3 feel kind of yummy on those two black keys, and then 3 and 4 up, and it feels sort of delicious to me. But it didn't feel like that to my students. Everything felt like something they were supposed to remember. There was no reward for it. And I was trying so desperately to figure out if there was some way to transmit my love of the contours of scales to my students in a way that would make them really understand how wonderful it could be to use this vocabulary of music. And then I wanted to have the rhythmic interest be compelling, but not difficult. So that's also really tricky. So what I ended up coming up with, and it's taken me a long time to make this product, and I have used it with my students for years and refined it and really made it so I'm completely happy with it. There's not a single thing I would change about this at this point. I made this thing called Smart Scales. And what we're launching today is the white key major scales. And part of the most important part of it is that I put them all in 6/8. Now, don't freak out that 6/8 is a difficult meter. It's super easy for kids to read. Part of the reason that it's easy for them to read is because the scales have beams, right? So all the notes either are single dotted quarter notes. So you just teach them to count to 3 on those. You don't even have to get into the actual meter of it that much. But you end up with these lovely dotted quarter notes, which give them moments to pause and kind of refocus themselves. So for instance, instead of going da 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 da, they might go da 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 dum, da 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 dum, da 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 dum, da 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 da, which of course is so much more beautiful, and it also helps them get that contour under their hands in a way that feels really good. The other thing is the lilt of 6/8 is so compelling, right? The sense of movement when you get enough notes in a row, you sort of build up. It sort of reminds me of like when you push a kid on a swing and it goes da 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 dum, da 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 dum. It has that feel about it that is so kind of human and lovely. And so when I stumbled, I say stumbled only in the sense that I tried everything in the whole world and figured out that was the way I really wanted to do it. It turned into magic with my students. So then there was another problem, which was that I wanted my students to be able to experience these with some sort of harmony underneath them. And I wanted them to have plenty of time to get all of these beautiful melodies into their ear. And so what I wanted to do was make it possible for the teacher, i.e. you or me, to collaborate instead of correcting. So what I did was I wrote what I hope you'll think are beautiful accompaniments that are written underneath each one of these melodies. And so what it does is it turns you into a participant instead of always being the person that says no. Because I don't know about you, but I don't enjoy saying no. I don't love doing that. But if I'm collaborating with them and if I'm playing with them, then they actually will just hear when something goes wrong. Half the time, you don't even need to say anything. Or you can say something like, do you think something went wrong? Where do you think it went wrong? Instead of, well, that wasn't the right thing. So the other thing is, I really, when I think back to my time when I was in school, some of the highest moments for me were when I would play concertos and my teachers, John Perry, Fleischer, people like that, these amazing people that I was able to study with, would accompany me. Even if they weren't playing, let's say, in a competition for me, but they would play the second piano part with me in a lesson. And I got such a rush out of that. And I think we sometimes forget how powerful it is to play with our students, right? That is something that we forget. We tend to do it right at the beginning. In the very beginning of method books, there are often accompaniments that are written for the simplest of things. But then there's sort of a dearth of it, a dearth of comfortable, beautiful accompaniments that are written to help students really understand and experience the music in a way that gets them really invested and also gets us out of that role of just sort of sitting there and, thinking, oh man, can I drink coffee this late in the afternoon? Oh, I better not, Instead of that, you can say, hey, let's play smart scales together. So this is what smart scales turned into. Every unit in this particular resource has 14 different 4-measure lines. And I would highly recommend that you play them with the repeats, because usually they start at the bottom and then go all the way up to the top, or they start at the top and go down to the bottom. So each individual one, if you take the repeat, requires them to do an extra piece of orienting themselves in that key. And as you can see, the way that I printed them, in the beginning of each unit, you see, for instance, in this one, if you look at the right hand, the first example is shown without a key signature. So this is the E major one. And you can see those sharps actually written on those notes. So if this is the first time they've encountered an E major scale, there's no reason to put those in the key signature the very first time. It's sort of nasty, really. So this way you can explain it to them, and if they've already had some experience with it, you can use it to review. But this way they get an actual visible representation of what's going on. And in this particular one, it's kind of worth noticing every first example just is 2 measures long, but they're not always exactly the same. The right hand one is tailored exactly for the best way to introduce that in the right hand. The left hand is tailored for the exact best way to introduce it in the left hand. And our hands are not the same, they're mirror images of each other. So everyone is tailored to make it as comfortable as it possibly can be. Now, another thing that's interesting about it is they switch back and forth from left hand to right hand, and they don't always just go left hand, right hand, left hand, right hand. They have to actually be on top of it. So for a student, they have to say, I'm going to start here with the right hand. Oh, wait, this one starts in the left hand at the top of the scale, for instance. And there's lots of fingering. If you look, for instance, on this one, if you look at number 12, you'll see, for instance, that it says 1, 3, 2, 1. So anytime there's a skip, there's an extra finger number. But they can't just play by finger number, because if they did, they'd play da 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 dum, da 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 dum. There, they wouldn't cross under. So they have to actually learn how to cross under. Playing by finger number doesn't work, but there's lots and lots of fingering in there to help them make those changes in the most comfortable way. Now, the way that the teacher and student parts are printed, I intentionally printed the teacher part right under the student part so that you can see exactly what the student is supposed to be doing. And there's also lots of fingering in the teacher part. And that's not because I think teachers can't figure it out if that's all they were doing. But I don't know about you, when I am actually playing these with my students, I'm thinking about my student at the same time. And so you don't have all of your abilities available to you. So there's lots of extra help written in. The teacher part is slightly smaller and it's slightly lighter. It's scaled back a tiny bit. And I have never had a student be even slightly confused about what they were supposed to play or which part they were responsible for. It doesn't seem to make any difference at all. So I'm sure at this point you're kind of interested in what they might sound like. So now we're going to play a recording. This is my sweet student Armand, and he came to his last lesson, and he was kind of raised on smart scales. I taught him all of these and all of the keys as we went. So this week I just pulled out E major and I said, let's just play straight through this. This is without the repeats. So this is just to give you an example of how much material there is for lateral learning and getting really comfortable in one key without getting bored. So it stays novel, it stays new. So let's listen to us. Now, you could hear at the end, I put in my arm around him and he said, "Good work," which just cracked me up. And I can't promise that your students will all play as beautifully as Armand plays, but I can tell you that I think this certainly didn't hurt his musicality, playing these and learning about the shapes and the way that music can be put together. So it's been a lot of fun. One other thing I did want to say is that for many of my students, they have a parent, one or the other of their parents plays reasonably well. Some of them play quite well. Some of them play, a little bit. But they enjoy playing the accompaniments with their parents when they're at home. And even if they can't play both hands, they can play one hand. Even one hand or the other is a whole lot more than none. And that gives them an extra way to participate in piano lessons and in the musical experiences of their students. And I happened to be talking to one of my friends who I was saying I was going to launch this product. And she said, "Well, what's it like?" And I had this recording with me of Armand, and I played it for her. And she said, "Oh, it's so peaceful and beautiful." And I thought, oh, that's so great. I mean, because that's just not the experience many of us have when we try to teach scales to our students. It's just not what it's about. So that made me feel really happy that it's just pleasant to listen to, which I think makes it something that we, of course, are going to be much more likely to do at our lessons, and then the kids are going to be more likely to do it at home. So at the end of the book, after each of these units has been presented, there's something that I call greatest hits. And what this is a mixed up version. So it starts off with, this first one happens to be in C major, but as you can see, it's C major, but it's with the left hand, and it starts at the top of the scale. So they have to take a look at it, figure out what key signature it is, what scale it's going to be. And they're a little bit tricky. They don't all start on the tonic. They don't all start on, if it's a D major scale, they don't necessarily start on D. And they're switching around. They're going from right hand to left hand. There are a few of them where I did put a few right or left hand ones in a row because it just seemed like it was getting a little bit too difficult. But that's an extra way to kind of double check and see, have they actually gotten the skills involved to actually decode it themselves? Because if they're playing all of them in the same key, obviously they don't have to keep reading the key signature. But that's part of what you're trying to do, is get it so that when they see the key signature, they have a physical response in their hand and they start to understand what it'll feel like to play in that key comfortably.